Chapter 5, Base Camp. Alright. At base camp, we set about the task of preparing ourselves for the job ahead. Our first concern was to acclimatize. The problem of getting the best out of the members of such an expedition is always one of the most difficult, which a conscious leader must face. It is threefold, and may be discussed under the headings fatigue, acclimatization, and illness. The question of fatigue is twofold. If a man is overworked, he becomes tired. If he is underworked, he becomes lazy. The question of acclimatization is threefold. First, a man must spend some time high before he is able to work effectively. Second, if he stays high too long, he deteriorates. The effect of being high is thus very similar to that of being in a sleeping bag. Third, if he goes low, he will probably be able to recuperate. The whole thing is complicated by the psychological factor, and on this score I have but one rule. A contented climber is a good climber. Thanks to the splendid work of Prone, the expedition was remarkably free from illness. All were fit and well, except poor Burley, who had fallen victim to base camp lassitude, and consequently was not acclimatizing as quickly as the others, and Prone, who is smitten with mysterious and complicated symptoms, namely pallor, profuse sweating, pulse rapid and soft, temperature subnormal, deep breathing and sighing, restlessness and thirst, cold extremities, faintness, dizziness, and buzzing in the ears. Poor fellow, he was much distressed both by his condition and by the fact he was unable to diagnose his ailment. The problem was finally solved by Constant, who produced a first aid manual and pointed out that the symptoms were exactly those of a hemorrhage, except that the last two were missing, namely insensibility and death. He said there was still hope. Prone then discovered that he had cut himself in the ear while shaving and was slowly bleeding to death. After stopping the bleeding by holding ice against his ear, and afterwards treating himself for surgical shock and frostbitten ear, he went down with Italian measles. The days of acclimatization were spent according to the character and duties of the individual. Burley superintended, as well as his condition would allow, the unpacking and repacking of stores, and in his more active moments, evading the scientific attentions of Wish, who insisted on subjecting him as the heaviest man of the party to a harrowing process known as a fatigue test. Wish was fully occupied with research of various kinds. At almost any time of day he could be seen shoveling or drilling the ice of the glacier, taking thermometer readings at various strategic points, hitting rocky outcrops with hammers, or calibrating his boiling point thermometers. He offered a prize for every specimen of creature brought to him, and for every Wharton's App Warple, but though we spent much time poking into crevices and lifting stones, none of us was able to supplement his income. Wish chose me, the lightest of the party, as his second subject for the fatigue test. Being anxious to encourage every aspect of the expedition, I did my best to satisfy his demands. But I became so exhausted that I had little energy to spare for the others, which was rather unfair, but no complaints were heard, which was a tribute to the prevailing team spirit. Shute took the opportunity to give his gear a thorough try. Try hour. See? I think that's supposed to be over. Try over. His favorite test piece was myself running up and down the hill which Wish had chosen for his fatigue test. I could only hope that these sequences would not be given in the final film the emphasis which they received at the time. Jungle's job was to prepare the walkie-talkie apparatus and instruct us in its use. I have always had a horror of electrical gadgets I was received to find that our sets were quite simple to operate, besides being too weak to hurt us. But although the gear was simple, the method of using them was not. In my ignorance, I thought that we could call each other up as one does on the telephone, but it is much more complicated than that. In the first place, you never address this person by his real name. Code names are used. Jungle gave us our code names, which were as follows: Burley, Deadweight; Constant, Applecart; Wish, Fiddler; Prone, Ailing; Shoot, Dickybird; myself, Binder. There was some argument about Jungle's code name. He himself had picked Pathfinder, but this for some reason proved unpopular with the others. Shoot, rather tactlessly I thought, suggested that Path Loser would be more appropriate. Eventually we compromised with Wanderer, but Jungle seemed hurt. Then we had to learn the language. One must never under any circumstances speak in the normal manner to say, for instance, yes, no, or very well, is quite unheard of. Instead, one must use such expressions as that is correct, can do, will do, Roger, and so on. 2 o'clock becomes 1400 hours, and midnight, for some obscure mathematical reason, must never be referred to. To go east is to proceed 090, and 20,000 feet becomes Angels 20. There is also an elaborate ceremonial to be observed when calling up and replying. Finally, we were forbidden to use our ordinary voices. We must speak in a kind of chant which would make it difficult to tell one voice from the other. The younger members seemed to get a good deal of innocent fun from this ritual, but I must confess that I found it a little confusing. The radio sets were made small to save weight, and their range was limited. It might sometimes be necessary to have messages relayed via one or two intermediaries. In view of certain youthful experiences at children's parties, I decided that some practice was advisable. I asked the party to form a large circle over the whole width of the glacier so that messages could be sent right around. At first, I was quite unable to think of a message. My brain seemed to have frozen, and I stood for some minutes feeling foolish. At last I managed somehow to compose the first message. How serene is Doodle in the morning light. This came back as Binder's Butterbeans. After some thought, I sent out the following. Please pay very careful attention to the message. This too came back as Binder's Butterbeans. This was absurd. As an experiment, I sent out Binder's Butterbeans. This returned as, the voice of the leader is sweet music in the ears of the followers. This sort of thing went on all morning. I was determined not to give up until we had mastered the technique, and greatly to my delight, the messages began coming through perfectly, without any apparent reason for change just before lunchtime. By great coincidence, we had butterbeans for lunch, which I thought was rather amusing. Some of us were inclined to be skeptical about the value of the radio, but we were shortly to receive striking proof of its usefulness. I was taking a walk one morning by myself in order to meditate on the responsibilities of leadership when my walkie-talkie began to buzz. I put it to my ear and heard a voice. Applecart to Binder, are you receiving me? Over. I flicked the switch to transmit and said, Binder to Applecart, receiving you loud and clear. Are you receiving me? Over. Back came the reply. Applecart to Binder, receiving you strength 8. Turn tip 2 notches. Over. I turned up 2 notches and said, Binder to Applecart, have turned up 2 notches. Are you receiving me? Over. Applecart to Binder, receiving you loud and clear. Good morning. Do you know where Corkscrew is? Over. Binder to Applecart, please say again. Over. Binder to Applecart to Binder, I say again, receiving you loud and clear. Good morning. Do you know where Corkscrew is? Over. Binder to Applecart, good morning. Corkscrew is in right-hand pocket of spare trousers. Over. Applecart to Binder, Roger. Over and out. One wonders how earlier expeditions managed at all without the boon of radio. Constant had the job of paying off the redundant porters and instructing the remainder in their future duties. We retained 88 porters and 11 boys for the return journey, the rest being dismissed. Of the 99, those who were not actively employed on the mountain were to move base camp to another position where it would be safe from avalanches. Constant considered that could be left to do the job themselves, as he had made everything quite clear to them. This was a relief to me, as every available European would be needed on the mountain. I made a special study of the effects of rarefied atmosphere on human behavior, and had asked the others to tell me of any unusual experiences which might occur to them on the mountain. Even at the comparatively moderate height of base camp, altitude effects were already perceptible. During an impromptu game of cricket, Burley swore at the umpire, a thing which would never happen at sea level, while Wish showed a tendency to take more than his share of marmalade. But these were temporary effects which would disappear with acclimatization. It was interesting to notice how the diverse characters of my companions influenced their choice of literature. Burley whiled away his hours of lassitude with Bulldog Drummond. Wish could be found almost any evening huddled over a melting block of ice reading Martians and Atom Men. Chute relaxed with three-dimensional murder. Jungle displayed an unexpectedly romantic soul with Love in the Labyrinth, while Prone was never to be seen without a copy of his own work, The Secret of Radiant Health, except when he had mislaid it. My duties did not follow or allow for frivolous relaxation, but it's worth recording that Bing the Bang spent much of his leisure immersed in a Yogastani translation of Three Men in a Boat. We foregathered in the evening for a social hour, and many a spirited discussion took place at these gatherings. On one occasion we discussed the old question, should oxygen and other artificial aids be used on mountains? Burley said this was a lot of ruddy lumber, more trouble than it was worth. He told us about his friend Baffles, who carried an oxygen set weighing 40 pounds to the summit of Me Wordle, only to find, when he got there, that the apparatus had been out of order all the time. Wish said that this remark was typical of a layman's ignorant point of view. We had a unique opportunity to test our gear under rigorous conditions, and our duty was to do so. He asked Burley why, if he disagreed with its use, he was willing to use it. Burley asked whether Wish expected him to climb the ruddy mountain naked. Wish said that this was a typical unscientific argument. He said he had long been aware that to some the ascent of the mountain partook of the frivolous nature of a sporting event. He himself took a sterner view. To him, the climax of our efforts would be the fulfillment of his own self-dedicated task of determining the melting point of ice on the summit. He reminded Burley that without oxygen, the exacting intellectual efforts which this delicate experiment demanded would be quite impossible. Burley, rather tactlessly I thought, said that, speaking with wide experience and excellent memory, he could recall nothing which approached this for futility. He said that nobody except a demented scientist would want to melt ice on the tops of mountains, and even if he did, who cared what the temperature was? He told us about his friend Stokes, who had had the ice melted under his feet by a scientist on the summit of Schmitzgutzitzen and had lost 3 toes in the consequence. He said that any scientist was a menace on a mountain. While they were arguing this point with their usual commendable frankness, Chute said that without artificial aids, the taking of 3-dimensional films would also be impossible, and this prompted Jungle to remark that that was sufficient justification for doing without them. His own motive for climbing was to escape from mechanical civilization and everything it stood for, especially films. Constant said that he deplored the narrow outlook of others. He climbed solely to demonstrate the triumph of spirit over adverse circumstance. He said that artificial aids were unsportsmanlike, and if they were carried to their logical extreme, we might find climbers impaling the summit of a mountain with a long-range harpoon attached to a rope ladder. If summits could not be climbed unaided, they were better left unclimbed. Prone said this was rubbish. If artificial aids were refused, tents and clothing must go with them. He asked Constant if his triumphant spirit was prepared to climb rum doodle in loincloth, or worse. Although I believe in plain speaking between friends, I really felt that it was being overdone on this occasion. I therefore reminded all the words of Trotter on the subject. No practical mountaineer would refuse the help of science, but there are limits. I expected this to put an end to the discussion, for what more is there to say? But nobody seemed to take any notice. It was obvious to me We were all suffering from the rarefied atmosphere.